Hello, my name is Sophia Slamain, and this is my presentation for MHS 3063 for Professor Anderson. This is about the suicide rates among Native Americans, also known as American Indians slash Alaska Natives, and they will be referred to as Native Americans from here on out. The objectives for today's presentation: we will review the suicide rates of all minority groups, determine the highest rate among all minority groups, and identify the audience and the methods to eliminate the disparity. So who are we going to target as an audience and discuss methods to decrease suicide rates? Here I have the suicide rate among females in different minority groups, and the rates are from 1999 and 2017, and this is per 100,000. So for American Indians slash Alaska Natives, in 1999, the suicide rate among this group is 4.6, and in 2017, the suicide rate is 11. So we can see right away that the suicide rate has increased. For white Americans, we have the suicide rate as in 1999 as 4.7, and in 2017 the suicide rate is 7.9. So we can see that there is also an increase. For Asian Pacific Islanders, in 1999 the suicide rate is 3.4, and the suicide rate in 2017 is 3.9. Although there is an increase, it's not as significant as the increase of the other minority groups, especially when compared to the Native Americans. For Black people, the suicide rate in 1999 is 1.7, and in 2017 the suicide rate is 2.8. Once again, we are seeing an increase. For Hispanic people, the suicide rate in 1999 is 1.9, and in 2017, the suicide rate is 2.6. Once again, there's an increase. So we see an increase for each group. However, the increase is not as significant as the increase of suicide rates among the Native American group. Next, we have the suicide rates among male minority groups, comparing the rates from 1999 to 2017 per 100,000. And of course, our source is NCHS, National Vital Statistics System, mortality. So for the Native American group in 1999, the suicide rate is 19.8. And in 2017, the suicide rate is 33.8. Now, look at that number. That is a significant increase. And it makes me question what is a factor that could contribute to the increase in suicide rates among this group and among other groups. For white males in 1999, the suicide rate is 20.2, and the suicide rate in 2017 is 28.2. Now we see another significant increase. And for Black males, the suicide rate in 1999 is 10.8, and in 2017 the suicide rate is 11.4. For Hispanic males, the suicide rate is 10.3 in 1999, and in 2017 the suicide rate is 11.2. For Asian Pacific Islander males, the suicide rate is 1999, and the suicide rate is 9 in 1999, and in 2017 the suicide rate is 9.9. So we see that there is an increase, but when comparing males to females for each minority group, we see that the suicide rate among males are much higher and the increase is much higher. So, who has the highest suicide rate? When looking at the suicide rate among female and male minority groups, Native Americans have the highest suicide rate. So compared to the overall US population, American Indian/Alaska Natives groups have alarmingly higher suicide rates. According to the CDC, the rates have been increasing since 2003. In the 18 states that have been participating in the National Violent Death Reporting System, where suicide is monitored, American Indian/Alaskan Native suicide rates were 21.5 per 100,000, according to the CDC. That is more than 3.5 times higher than other racial/ethnic groups. So more than 35.71 of American Indian/Alaskan Native descendants who committed suicide were aged between 10 to 24 years old, when compared with whites where the percentage is 11.1%. So of course we have to look at the incidence and compare why this group has a higher suicide rate than this other group. When looking at the incidence compared to whites, American Indians/Alaska Natives had 6.6 times the odds of living in a non-metropolitan area, 2.1 times the odds of a positive alcohol toxicology report, and 2.4 times the odds of a suicide of a friend or family member affecting their own death. Now, by witnessing suicides, this can increase the risk of an individual's suicide, likelihood of committing suicide, and this can also lead to suicide clusters, and I will elaborate more on that in the coming slides. So I want to compare another group to the American Indian/Alaskan Native community. So in the African American community, where disparities are more common and prevalent, they happen to have a low suicide rate compared to the American Indian/Alaskan Native community. Based on 2014 data, suicide rates in the African American community is 5.46 per 100,000. However, the suicide rate among African Americans between the ages 5 to 10 were higher. Similarly, suicide rates are higher among men than women in both groups. However, keep in mind that suicide rates among the African American community is on the rise. When looking at disparities, we should also look at the possible contributions to the disparity. When assessing disparities, the factors that may put the community at risk or protect them from the issues are considered. These factors are known as risk factors and protective factors. So these risk factors, as discussed in the previous slide, these factors are also known as modifiable and unchangeable. So what are unchangeable factors? Unchangeable factors include historical trauma and family history. It is known that history cannot be undone. What happens, happens. Whereas we have our modifiable factors. What are they? This includes alcohol and drug use. We can modify this by encouraging therapy or uh, support groups. Same thing with depression. Social support is extremely important, and learning about mental health issues is extremely important. How to manage them and knowing when to seek help. Reclaiming cultural values. This is where social support plays in. Going to someone with similar cultural beliefs and values can be really helpful for the person struggling with mental health issues and suicidal thoughts. So, what are suicide clusters and who's at risk for them? Suicide clusters are known as several suicides or suicide attempts that occur close in time. Studies have found greater risk for clusters among young adult/adolescent males who engage in acute or chronic alcohol abuse. Additional cluster risk factors include exposure to suicide, family relationships, unemployment, home life, and loss of tradition. So with the exposure to suicide, especially when the person exposed to suicide is close with the victim, this increases their risk for suicide. Now, you may be asking or wondering what the link is between American Indian/Alaska Natives and suicide clusters. With young people at risk for suicide clusters and the high suicide rate among young American Indian/Alaskan Natives, there are concerns regarding the potential risk for suicide clusters. So suicide clusters are common among the young adolescents and young adults, and suicide happens to be common among American Indian/Alaskan Natives who also happen to be young adults and adolescents. So there is a potential risk. So, as mentioned in the previous slides, it has been noted that exposure to suicide can lead to self-harm and suicide. When the individual has witnessed a suicide or had a relationship with the victim, the individual is at vulnerable risk of developing self-harming tendencies, and suicidal thoughts/attempts. Now imagine if an individual were to commit suicide and they had multiple friends that they were close to. Just imagine how that could impact these people and how suicide clusters are able to form. Vulnerability increases when the individual deals with factors such as mental health issues, substance abuse, or family instability. Now, most of these things are risk factors that can increase vulnerability, and they also happen to be factors that can be changed. This slide talks more about historical trauma and discrimination among the American Indian/Alaskan Native group. And this happens to, especially the historical trauma happens to be one of the unchangeable factors that also happen to put the community at risk for suicide. The risk factors discussed previously must be considered in the context of historical trauma. So this includes mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior and thoughts, alcohol abuse. So historical trauma. This includes the forced relocation, genocide, separation of families, disruption of traditional language and cultural practices. These have all had a negative impact on many American Indian/Alaska Native communities. The American Indian/Alaska Native youth may feel a sense of loss and hopelessness as they feel that they do not contribute much with their connections between them and their families. And this is because their families and their familial and cultural ties have been severed. And this is because of history. And as I mentioned before, history cannot be undone. What has happened has happened. So what can we do to reduce risk factors and increase protective factors? To decrease risk factors and increase protective factors, we should find solutions that resonate with the community's cultural values, because we do not want to impose and have methods that contradict with their cultural beliefs and values. We want to be more inclusive as healthcare professionals. So what are factors that resonate with such values? The factors that resonate with such values include following a more traditional lifestyle, rekindling broken relationships, and discussing problems with family and friends. Having social support decreases the risk of harmful behavior and suicide. Having someone to turn to, whether it's a family or a friend, can be really helpful. And rekindling broken relationships. That could be something that is having a broken relationship can be on the mind constantly, and we don't know how such things can impact people. Things impact people differently. So we want to find solutions that work for everyone. What can be done to reduce risk factors and increase protective factors? One solution includes working as a community to prevent suicide and decrease the risks. So educating people on the importance of mental health and when to seek help and when to look for those who are unable to seek help or refuse help. Look for those people that need guidance and guide them in your own way, or guide them to others who can guide them. Tribal governance and community control over resources are associated with decreasing the risk of suicide. So when talking about resources, we're talking about mental health resources, social support, services that can assist these people and teach them how to manage their symptoms and how to control obsessive thoughts, suicidal thoughts. And if they feel as if they can't control them, they should know when to seek help. The community can also work to provide members who need guiding with cultural centers. So this can be something like a library where books on the history and culture of the community are always available, or maybe having an individual constantly available to teach people about their heritage and culture and encourage cultural practices, because as discussed before, feeling a sense of a loss of cultural and traditional values can impact one's mental health, and this also happens to be a modifiable risk. And also, finally, another method is functioning institutions where education, health, and safety are prioritized. This can also reduce the risks. Institutions where other people can go and seek help and seek education and safety. So, what are some methods that can be done to help decrease the disparity or decrease the risk of committing suicide? The community can work together to decrease suicide rates and risks. This is very important when looking to address the disparity. Meetings should be held to educate the members of the community so that they are able to identify people at risk of committing suicide. We should also emphasize the importance of mental health by encouraging individual and group counseling. We want to encourage people to seek help when necessary, seek social support. We do not wait for those who are at risk to come to you. We should actively search for people to help, especially if we have free time. And something that I thought of personally is conducting surveys where the individual assesses themselves for any risk factors or suicidal behaviors. So a survey can be given, let's say, where can we find young people and adolescents, high schools or colleges. So we can give those people who are in the Native American community surveys where they can assess themselves for any risk factors or suicidal behavior. And let's say government officials or people who are of higher ranking, such as teachers, counselors, these people can review the results and target those who need help, identify those who need help, and provide them with resources. But as a whole, we should provide resources to each and every person who may be at risk or who may not be at risk. So, in conclusion, among all minority groups, American Indians / Alaskan Natives have the highest suicide rate. And so, we should target this group, work to decrease suicide rates, and identify those who are at risk for suicide. How can we do that? By providing social support services, mental health services, educational resources, whether it's about mental health or cultural beliefs and values. We can encourage group therapy and just educate people on the importance of mental health. We must emphasize the importance of mental health and educate the American Indian / Alaskan Native community. Spreading awareness is very important. And we can do this by holding annual health fairs, targeting each and every minority group. And of course, there are many other methods to explore. And finally, we have reached the end of the presentation where I've included all of the resources that I used. I have included data and more information on suicide clusters. So if anyone feels that they want to learn more about the disparities among specifically this disparity among the American Indian / Alaska Native group, you can always come here and use the links provided to access these resources and learn more, and hopefully spread awareness and actively look for methods that can help decrease the suicide rates for this group and hopefully all groups, because no group should be singled out. But I hope that everyone learned more, and that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching.